Sometimes life puts us on paths of deception to teach us about the true weight of our choices. For 6 years, I lived 2 completely different lives with 2 different men, and neither one knew about the other. Hello, my dear ones. I'm Maggie, and today I'm 85 years old with a heart full of stories to tell. Before I begin this story that completely changed my life, I'd like to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me such joy to know that my stories reach so many different places. Today I'm going to tell you how I went from being a simple small-town girl to living the most complicated lie of my life, and how the truth eventually set me free, even though it nearly destroyed me first. This story begins in 1960, when I was just 25 years old and thought I knew what love was. I was so terribly wrong. Back then I was living in Paso Robles, a quiet little town in California where everyone knew everyone else's business. The town sat nestled between rolling hills covered in oak trees and vineyards, where the air always smelled of dry grass and wildflowers. My father worked at the local grain mill, his hands permanently stained with flour dust, and my mother took in sewing to help make ends meet. Their bedroom was filled with the constant whir of her Singer sewing machine late into the night, the sound becoming the lullaby of my childhood. I was what people called a dreamer, always looking beyond those rolling hills that surrounded our town, wondering what lay beyond the horizon. While other girls my age were content to marry local boys and settle down to raise families, I felt restless, like a bird trapped in a cage that was too small for my wings. The smell of wildflowers in spring and the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings should have been enough for any girl, but not for me. I wanted more. I wanted adventure, excitement, a life bigger than what Paso Robles could offer. I spent hours at the town library, reading magazines about life in big cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, studying the photographs of women in fashionable clothes, walking down busy streets lined with tall buildings and bright lights. Those women looked so sophisticated, so free, so different from the farm wives and shopkeepers I saw every day in our little town. When I announced to my family that I was moving to San Francisco to find work, you would have thought I'd told them I was joining the circus. My mother's face went white as fresh milk, and she had to sit down in her favorite rocking chair to catch her breath. "Young ladies don't travel alone to big cities, Margaret Rose," she said, using my full name the way she did when she was truly serious. "It's not proper, and it's certainly not safe. What will people think?" My father was even more direct in his opposition. "You've got a perfectly good life here," he said, his voice stern but worried. "There are plenty of fine young men in this town who would be happy to marry you. Why do you want to go chasing after something that probably doesn't even exist?" But I was determined. I'd been saving money from my job at Peterson's General Store for 2 years, hiding dollar bills in a coffee tin under my bed. I had enough for a bus ticket to San Francisco and a few weeks' rent while I looked for work. In 1960, young unmarried women simply didn't leave home alone, but I was prepared to be the exception. I packed my few belongings into a worn leather suitcase that had belonged to my grandmother, the same woman who had scandalized the family 50 years earlier by learning to drive an automobile when most people still traveled by horse and buggy. Maybe rebellion ran in our blood. The morning I left, my mother cried as if I were going off to war. She packed me a lunch of fried chicken and biscuits, wrapped in a cloth napkin that smelled like the lavender sachets she kept in all the dresser drawers. "Promise me you'll write every week," she said, pressing a small leather-bound Bible into my hands. "And promise me you'll come home if things don't work out." I promised, though I had no intention of coming back with my tail between my legs. I was going to make something of myself in the big city, and I was going to prove that a small-town girl could succeed in a world much larger than the one she'd been born into. The journey to San Francisco felt like traveling to another planet. The Greyhound bus was filled with travelers, salesmen in rumpled suits, families moving to new cities for work, young people like myself seeking adventure. As the bus wound through the California valleys, leaving behind the familiar golden fields of home, I pressed my face against the window and watched my old life disappear mile by mile. The landscape changed from rural farms to small cities to sprawling suburbs, and finally to the urban sprawl that surrounded San Francisco Bay. The closer we got to the city, the more my heart raced with equal parts anticipation and terror. What if I couldn't find work? What if I couldn't survive in such a big, impersonal place? What if my parents were right, and I was making the biggest mistake of my life? When I finally stepped off that bus at the Greyhound station in downtown San Francisco, the noise hit me like a physical force. Cars honking, people shouting, the clatter of streetcars on their tracks, the rumble of buses pulling in and out of the station. It was overwhelming and exhilarating all at once. The air smelled different too. Not the clean scent of grass and wildflowers I was used to, but a mixture of exhaust fumes, coffee, cigarette smoke, and something indefinably urban that I would later come to love. People rushed past me in all directions, everyone moving with purpose and urgency, dressed in clothes that looked like they'd stepped out of the magazines I'd studied so carefully back home. I stood there for several minutes, clutching my suitcase and trying to get my bearings, when a kind elderly gentleman in a postal worker's uniform noticed my confusion. "First time in the city, miss?" he asked with a gentle smile. When I nodded, he gave me directions to the nearest boarding house district and warned me to be careful about who I trusted. "San Francisco can be a wonderful place for a young lady," he said, "but it can also be dangerous if you're not smart about things. Stick to the main streets, don't go out alone after dark, and always let someone know where you're going." His kindness gave me the courage I needed to venture out into this new world that would become my home for the next several years. I found a small room in a boarding house on Polk Street, run by a stern Irish woman named Mrs. O'Malley, who had strict rules about visitors, noise, and what she called moral conduct. The house was a tall, narrow Victorian painted in faded blue, with a front porch where the other boarders would sit in the evenings, smoking cigarettes and talking about their days. Mrs. O'Malley showed me to my room on the 3rd floor, barely big enough for a single bed, a small dresser with a spotted mirror, and a wooden chair by the window. But oh, that window! It looked out onto the street below, and I could watch the endless parade of people going about their lives in this fascinating city. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I would sit by that window and watch the streetlights create pools of golden light on the pavement, imagining the stories of all the people who walked past. The room cost $8 a week, which seemed like a fortune at the time, but Mrs. O'Malley included breakfast and dinner in the price, served family style in her dining room with mismatched chairs and a long table covered in faded oilcloth. The other boarders were mostly working people. A secretary named Ruth, who worked for a law firm downtown, a young man named Frank, who was studying to be an accountant, and an elderly retired teacher named Miss Peterson, who spent most of her time reading novels and correcting everyone's grammar. They welcomed me kindly enough, though I could tell they were curious about what had brought a country girl like me to the big city. Within a week, I'd found work at Morrison's fabric shop on Union Square, thanks to a help-wanted sign I spotted while exploring the downtown area. The owner, Mr. Morrison, was a kind man in his 60s who took pity on a young girl from the country. When I walked into his shop with my small-town clothes and nervous smile, "Have you ever worked with fabrics before?" he asked. And when I told him about helping my mother with her sewing and about my job at Peterson's General Store back home, he nodded approvingly. "Well, it's not quite the same as selling dry goods in a small town, but I think you might have the right attitude for this work. We'll start you at 65 cents an hour and see how you do." Morrison's was like stepping into a treasure chest. The shop was filled with bolts of beautiful fabrics from all over the world. Silks from China that shimmered like water in the light. Woolens from Scotland so soft they felt like clouds. Cottons in every color imaginable, arranged like a rainbow along the walls. There were French laces delicate enough to be spider webs, velvets rich enough for royalty, and practical fabrics for everyday wear that still somehow managed to be beautiful. I loved running my hands over the different textures and helping customers choose just the right material for their projects. Some were professional seamstresses who knew exactly what they wanted, while others were housewives trying to make clothes for their families on tight budgets. I learned to listen carefully to what people really needed and to guide them toward choices that would make them happy without breaking their bank accounts. It was there, on a foggy Tuesday morning in October, that I first met Jimmy Sullivan, and my life took its first step toward the complications that would define the next 6 years. He was a traveling salesman who sold notions, buttons, ribbons, thread, zippers, and all the little things that made sewing complete. Jimmy represented a company based in Los Angeles that supplied small fabric shops throughout California, and he made regular stops at Morrison's about once a month to take orders and deliver goods. When he walked into the shop that morning, wearing a dark blue suit and carrying a leather sample case that looked expensive and professional, I felt my heart skip a beat. He was handsome in that classic early 1960s way, tall and lean with dark hair slicked back with pomade, kind brown eyes that seemed to twinkle when he smiled, and the confident bearing of a man who was comfortable talking to strangers. His shoes were polished to a shine, his tie was perfectly knotted, and everything about him spoke of success and sophistication. "Well, hello there," he said when he saw me behind the counter, arranging spools of thread by color. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Jimmy Sullivan, and you must be the prettiest salesgirl in all of San Francisco." The line was obviously one he'd used before, but his smile was so warm and genuine that I didn't mind. I blushed furiously and could barely stammer out my name, suddenly very aware of my simple dress and the fact that my hair wasn't styled in the fashionable way that city women wore theirs. "Mr. Morrison introduced us properly and explained that I was new to the city and the business. Jimmy spent the next hour going through his samples and taking our order, but I noticed that he kept glancing in my direction and including me in the conversation, even though I was just supposed to be learning by watching. When he was finished with business, he lingered by the counter, asking me questions about where I was from and how I was adjusting to city life. His interest seemed genuine, not just the professional friendliness of a salesman trying to make a good impression. "Paso Robles," he said when I told him where I was from. "I've driven through there on my way to San Luis Obispo. Pretty country, but I imagine it might get a little quiet for a young lady with ambition." When I admitted that quiet was exactly what I'd been trying to escape, he laughed and said, "I thought so. You've got that look about you, like someone who's ready for bigger things." From that day forward, Jimmy made sure to visit Morrison's every time he was in town, and those visits gradually became the highlight of my month. Jimmy's courtship was slow and careful, the way men approached relationships in those days when a woman's reputation was everything. He would bring me little gifts from his travels, a silk scarf from Los Angeles, chocolate from Seattle, a pressed flower from Portland that he'd picked during a stop to call on a customer. He never presumed anything or made me feel uncomfortable, always maintaining proper behavior, while still making it clear that his interest in me was more than professional. We would talk for hours during his visits to the shop, and gradually I began to look forward to those conversations as much as I looked forward to his gifts. The fog was rolling in from the bay the evening Jimmy first asked me to dinner. It was December of 1960, and the city was decorated for Christmas with lights strung across the streets and holiday displays in all the shop windows. "I know a little Italian restaurant in North Beach," he said, hat in hand, looking almost nervous despite his usual confidence. "Nothing fancy, but the food is good and the atmosphere is, well, it's romantic enough for a first date, if you'd be interested in that sort of thing." I said yes, of course, though I had to ask Mrs. O'Malley's permission to stay out past the boarding house's usual curfew for meals. We went to a little place called Mama Giuseppe's, tucked into a narrow alley where the smell of garlic and fresh bread made my mouth water before we even walked through the door. The restaurant was small and dimly lit, with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles that had collected years' worth of melted wax. Over plates of spaghetti and glasses of red wine that made me feel very sophisticated, Jimmy told me about his life on the road, traveling up and down the West Coast, selling his wares to small shops like Morrison's. "It's a lonely life sometimes," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand, his fingers warm and slightly rough from handling samples and merchandise all day. "I spend most of my time in hotels and my car, eating meals alone, making small talk with customers who forget my name as soon as I walk out the door. But I'm hoping to change that soon." The way he looked at me when he said those words made it clear that I was part of the change he had in mind, and I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with nervousness at the implications. Over the following months, our relationship deepened through a series of carefully chaperoned dates and long conversations during his business visits to Morrison's. Jimmy was everything a girl could want in 1960. Handsome, successful, well-mannered, and completely devoted to me. He talked about his dreams of settling down, maybe opening his own business, buying a house in one of San Francisco's nice neighborhoods where we could raise a family. He painted pictures of a future that seemed both exciting and secure, a perfect combination of urban sophistication and domestic happiness. His proposal came 6 months later, on a warm spring evening in May 1961, as we walked through Golden Gate Park. The cherry blossoms were in bloom, creating a canopy of pink and white petals above our heads, and families were scattered across the grass having picnics and playing with their children. It was the kind of scene that made you believe in happily ever after, the kind of perfect setting that romantic novels are made of. "Maggie Rose," he said, stopping suddenly on the path and dropping to one knee right there in front of God and everyone. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ring was small but beautiful, a single diamond that caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the cherry blossoms. Other couples walking nearby stopped to watch and smile, and a little girl clapped her hands in delight at the romantic scene. I said yes, of course. How could I not? Jimmy was everything I'd dreamed of when I'd imagined my new life in the city. Handsome, charming, successful, and completely devoted to making me happy. We were married on a Saturday afternoon in June 1961 at a small Catholic church in the Mission District, where Jimmy had arranged everything with the patient priest who'd agreed to marry us, despite the fact that neither of us was particularly religious. I wore a simple white dress that I'd sewn myself from fabric purchased at Morrison's, using my employee discount and working on it during my lunch breaks for weeks. The silk was imported from somewhere in Asia, and it felt like wearing liquid moonlight. Jimmy looked handsome in his best suit, a charcoal gray number that he'd bought specially for the occasion, and his smile when he saw me walking down the aisle made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. Mrs. O'Malley stood as my witness, wearing her best hat and trying not to cry, and one of Jimmy's traveling companions, a nice man named Pete, who sold kitchen supplies, served as his best man. After the ceremony, we had dinner at the Palace Hotel, feeling like the king and queen of San Francisco as we sat in the elegant dining room with its crystal chandeliers and linen tablecloths. The meal cost more than I usually made in a week, but Jimmy insisted on celebrating properly. "Only the best for my bride," he said, raising his champagne glass in a toast. Here's to our new life together, Mrs. Sullivan. For a while, everything seemed perfect, like something out of a fairy tale. Jimmy found us a small apartment on Russian Hill with a view of the bay, 2 rooms, and a tiny kitchen where I could practice the cooking skills my mother had tried to teach me before I'd been more interested in escaping than in learning domestic arts. The apartment was furnished simply but nicely, and Jimmy let me decorate it with pretty things from the shops downtown. Lace curtains for the windows, a colorful tablecloth for our small dining table, throw pillows that picked up the blues and greens of the view outside our window. I continued working at Morrison's while Jimmy traveled his routes, and Mr. Morrison gave me a raise and more responsibility now that I was a married woman. In those days, marriage was seen as a sign of maturity and stability, and married women were often trusted with tasks that single women might not have been given. I enjoyed the work and the independence it gave me, and I was proud to be contributing to our household income in a way that many wives of that era did not. But as the months passed, I began to feel the loneliness that Jimmy had warned me about during our courtship. He was gone for weeks at a time, leaving me alone in our apartment with nothing but the sound of foghorns and my own thoughts for company. The routine of work and solitary evenings began to feel remarkably similar to the small-town life I'd tried so hard to escape, just with different scenery outside the window. I tried to fill the empty hours with reading, sewing, and long walks through the city, but the silence grew heavier with each passing day, particularly in the evenings when other couples would be sharing dinner and conversation while I sat alone with a book and a simple meal for one. The fog that was so romantic when Jimmy was home to share it with me became oppressive when I was alone, rolling in from the Pacific like a gray blanket that muffled all the sounds of the city and made me feel isolated even in the middle of millions of people. I would stand at our window watching couples walk hand in hand down the street below, and I would wonder if this was really the exciting life I'd dreamed of when I'd left Paso Robles. Don't misunderstand me. I loved Jimmy deeply, and I was grateful for the life he'd given me. But I was beginning to realize that loneliness could exist anywhere, even in the most sophisticated and exciting places in the world. It was during one of these lonely periods, in March of 1962, that I received the letter that would change everything and set me on the path to the most complicated and painful period of my entire life. The letter was from my mother, written in her careful handwriting on the blue stationery she saved for important occasions. "My dear Margaret," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well and happy in your new life. I'm writing to let you know that I've been feeling poorly lately. Just a lingering cold that seems to have settled in my chest and won't let go. The doctor says it's nothing serious, but your father and I would be so grateful if you could come home for a visit and help me get back on my feet. I know you're busy with your own life now, but I find myself missing my daughter more than I care to admit." The letter continued with news from home: who had gotten married, who had moved away, which businesses had closed and which had opened. But it was that mention of her illness, however minor, that tugged at my heart in a way I hadn't expected. Despite all my rebellion against small-town life, despite my determination to build something bigger and better in the city, I still loved my parents deeply and felt responsible for their well-being. The thought of my mother being sick while I was hundreds of miles away, pursuing my own dreams, made me feel guilty and selfish. Jimmy was somewhere in Oregon on one of his long sales trips, unreachable as usual except through the company's main office, which would only relay messages in case of true emergencies. I wrestled with the decision for several days, reading and rereading my mother's letter, trying to decide if this was serious enough to justify the expense and trouble of a trip home. Finally, I packed a small suitcase with enough clothes for what I thought would be a week or two, left a note for Jimmy explaining where I'd gone, and bought a ticket on the next Greyhound bus to Paso Robles. The familiar smell of dry grass and oak trees filled my nostrils As the bus pulled into the small station where my father was waiting for me, his face creased with worry and relief. "Thank you for coming, sweetheart," he said, embracing me tightly. "Your mother's been asking for you every day since we mailed that letter." During the drive home through the quiet streets of my childhood, I was struck by how small everything seemed after living in San Francisco. The buildings that had once seemed substantial now looked tiny. The main street that had been the center of my universe was barely more than a few blocks long, and the population that had once felt overwhelming now seemed almost quaint. But there was also something comforting about the scale of everything, something peaceful about being able to see from one end of town to the other, about recognizing every face and being recognized in return. "Little Maggie Sullivan," called Mrs. Patterson from her front porch as we drove past. "How fancy you look in your city clothes." I waved back, surprised by how good it felt to be welcomed home so warmly by people who'd known me since I was born. My mother was indeed unwell, though not nearly as sick as her letter had suggested. She seemed more lonely than anything else, missing her daughter who had run off to the big city and left her parents to manage on their own. I stayed for 2 weeks, helping with household chores, cooking meals that reminded me of my childhood, and keeping her company during the long afternoons when my father was at work. It felt good to be needed again, to have my presence make a real difference in someone's daily life in a way that my job at Morrison's, meaningful as it was, somehow didn't quite achieve. It was during the second week of my visit, while I was walking to Peterson's general store to buy some groceries for dinner, that I ran into Tommy Martinez for the first time in almost 2 years. Tommy had been my first love, the boy I'd dated all through high school before I'd gotten these crazy ideas about leaving Paso Robles and seeing the world. He'd been my steady boyfriend for 3 years, and everyone in town had assumed we would get married right after graduation, settle down, and raise our children in the same small community where we'd both grown up. But I'd had other plans, bigger dreams that didn't include staying in Paso Robles for the rest of my life, and I'd broken up with Tommy the week before I left for San Francisco. It had been one of the hardest things I'd ever done, because Tommy was a good man who loved me deeply and deserved better than to be abandoned for dreams he couldn't understand. He'd taken the breakup hard, and I'd heard through letters from home that he'd spent months hoping I would change my mind and come back to him. Now here he was, standing in the produce section of Peterson's general store, examining tomatoes with the same careful attention he'd once given to everything in his life. Tommy had always been methodical, thoughtful, the kind of person who considered every angle before making a decision. When he saw me standing there in my city dress and styled hair, his face lit up like Christmas morning, and for a moment it was as if no time had passed at all. "Maggie Rose," he said, and hearing my name in his familiar voice made my heart do things it hadn't done since I was 17. "I heard you'd moved to the big city and gotten married. What brings you back home?" We talked for an hour right there between the vegetables and the canned goods, catching up on old times and mutual friends. Tommy had never married, he told me, though he'd dated a few girls over the years. He'd been too busy building his carpentry business and taking care of his aging parents. But the way he looked at me suggested that perhaps he'd also been waiting for something, or someone, to come back into his life. He was working as a carpenter now, building houses for the families that were starting to move into our area as California grew and expanded after the war. His hands were rougher than I remembered, calloused from years of working with wood and tools, but his eyes were the same warm brown that had made me fall in love with him when we were barely more than children. He'd always been handsome in a quiet, steady way that was completely different from Jimmy's flashy charm, and I found myself remembering why I'd loved him so much before I decided that love wasn't enough to keep me in a small town. Before I left for San Francisco, Tommy asked if he could write to me. "Just as friends," he said. But the warmth in his dark eyes suggested something more than friendship. I'd like to know how you're doing, how you're adjusting to married life in the big city. I gave him my address, telling myself it would be harmless to stay in touch with an old friend, though some part of me knew I was playing with fire. The bus ride back to San Francisco was filled with conflicted emotions. Guilt about Jimmy, confusion about my feelings for Tommy, and a strange sense that my carefully constructed new life was somehow incomplete in ways I was only beginning to understand. When I returned to our apartment on Russian Hill, Jimmy was waiting for me with flowers and apologies for not being there when I'd needed to leave. He'd gotten my note from the landlord and had cut his trip short to come home and be with me. "I should have been here for you," he said, holding me close and stroking my hair. A husband should be here when his wife's family needs help. His guilt made my own guilt about Tommy feel even heavier, and I found myself being extra affectionate and attentive to compensate for the feelings I was trying to deny. The letters from Tommy started arriving the week after I returned to San Francisco, forwarded through the general delivery at the post office downtown, where I'd arranged to pick them up during my lunch breaks. Tommy wrote about life in Paso Robles, about the houses he was building, about the way the hills turned golden in the evening light, and how the whole town smelled like hay and roses during the summer months. His words painted pictures of home that made me ache with longing for something I couldn't quite name, something that felt different from, but just as powerful as my love for Jimmy. I wrote back, carefully at first, telling him about city life and my work at the fabric shop, about the fog and the streetcars, and the fascinating mix of people who lived in San Francisco. But gradually, our correspondence became more personal, more intimate. Tommy reminded me of the girl I used to be before I became so focused on escaping my small-town life, before I decided that happiness had to come from somewhere else, from someone else, from a life completely different from the one I'd been born into. He saw something in me that Jimmy, for all his charm and devotion, seemed to miss, a connection to my roots, to the land and the community that had shaped me, to the person I had been before I'd reinvented myself as a sophisticated city woman. In his letters, I wasn't Mrs. James Sullivan, the urban wife with modern ideas and fashionable clothes. I was just Maggie Rose, the girl who'd climbed trees and picked wildflowers and dreamed about the future while lying in fields of tall grass under wide-open skies. When my mother's health took another turn for the worse in the fall of 1962, this time a more serious bout of pneumonia that the local doctor said required bed rest and constant care, I didn't hesitate to return to Paso Robles. Jimmy was traveling again, somewhere in Washington state selling notions to fabric shops in small logging towns, and I left him a note explaining that I needed to care for my mother and would be gone for as long as necessary. What I didn't mention in the note was how eager I was to see Tommy again, how much I'd been looking forward to our reunion during the long bus ride home. This visit lasted a month, and by the time I was ready to leave, my life had become infinitely more complicated than I ever could have imagined. Tommy had proposed to me too, and I had said yes, and I was wearing his grandmother's ring on my right hand, while Jimmy's wedding ring remained on my left. How had this happened? How had I, a woman who'd always prided herself on being honest and straightforward, become someone living such an elaborate lie? It happened gradually, like walking into quicksand one step at a time. Tommy and I had been spending every evening together while I cared for my mother during the day. He would come by after work, still wearing his carpenter's clothes and smelling of sawdust and honest labor, and we would sit on the front porch, talking about our memories and our dreams, while my parents dozed in front of the television inside. The attraction between us had never really died. It had just been buried under my ambitions and his hurt feelings, and being together again brought it all rushing back to the surface. "I never stopped loving you, Maggie," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I know you've got a life in San Francisco now, and I know you're married to a good man who who can give you things I never could. But I need you to know that if there's any part of you that still cares about me, still remembers what we had together, I'm willing to wait for you to figure out what you really want." The proposal happened on a Sunday evening, right there on the same porch where we'd shared our first kiss when we were teenagers. "I've been building us a house, you know," he said, taking my hands in his work-roughened ones. "Nothing fancy, but it's got a white picket fence and a garden plot where you could grow those roses you always loved. I've been working on it for over a year, hoping that maybe someday you'd come home for good and we could have the life we always talked about when we were kids." The ring he slipped onto my finger was different from Jimmy's, a simple gold band with a small emerald that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who'd lived her entire life in Paso Robles and had been perfectly happy doing so. "Will you marry me, Maggie Rose?" he asked. "Will you come home and build a life with me here where we both belong?" I said yes, and I meant it in that moment as completely as I'd meant it when I'd accepted Jimmy's proposal 2 years earlier. How is that possible? How can a person love 2 different men at the same time, want 2 completely different lives with equal intensity, make promises to both that feel absolutely genuine in the moment they're made? I don't have a good answer to that question. Even now, 60 years later, all I can say is that at 27 years old, I was confused about what I wanted, torn between 2 different versions of myself, and too afraid of making the wrong choice to make any choice at all. So instead, I made the worst choice possible. I decided to postpone the decision by living a lie so elaborate that it eventually took on a life of its own. I told Tommy that I needed time to settle my affairs in San Francisco, to quit my job properly, and figure out how to end my marriage without creating a scandal that would hurt Jimmy unnecessarily. I promised him that I would return to Paso Robles permanently within 6 months, and that we would be married the following spring. I told Jimmy that my mother's health was going to require regular visits home, possibly for years, and that I hoped he would understand if I needed to spend time caring for her on a regular basis. Both men believed me because they had no reason not to. Both men loved me and wanted what was best for me, even if it meant some sacrifice on their parts. Jimmy offered to help pay for my mother's medical expenses and suggested that we might eventually move closer to Paso Robles so I could be nearer to my family. Tommy started planning our wedding and continued working on the house he was building for us, adding special touches that he thought would make me happy. Built-in bookshelves because he remembered how much I loved to read, a sunny kitchen window over the sink where I could watch birds while doing dishes, a small studio room where I could set up a sewing machine and work on the kinds of projects I'd learned about at Morrison's. And I, caught between these 2 good men who deserved so much better than what I was giving them, began living the most complicated double life imaginable. I became an expert at deception, carefully timing my visits to Paso Robles for when Jimmy was traveling, intercepting mail, creating elaborate stories to explain my absences to both men, and maintaining 2 completely different identities depending on which town I was in. In San Francisco, I was Mrs. James Sullivan, the sophisticated city wife who worked in a fabric shop and dreamed of a house in the suburbs with modern appliances and fashionable furnishings. In Paso Robles, I was Tommy's fiancée, the small town girl who was just waiting to settle down and start a family in the house he was building with his own hands. I had 2 sets of clothes, 2 different perfumes, even 2 different styles of handwriting for my letters. I kept separate calendars tracking both men's schedules, and I became an actress playing 2 different roles depending on my audience. The physical distance between the 2 cities made the deception possible in a way that would be almost impossible today, with cell phones and social media and all the ways people stay connected across distances. In 1962, long-distance phone calls were expensive and usually reserved for emergencies. Mail took days to travel even within California, and people rarely traveled far from their hometowns except for special occasions. If you told someone you were in a different city, they had no easy way to verify that information. And if you said you couldn't be reached for a few days, that was simply accepted as a normal part of life. But the emotional distance I had to maintain from both men was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. I couldn't be completely honest with either of them. Couldn't share my real thoughts and feelings without risking exposure. I couldn't tell Jimmy about my homesickness for Paso Robles without raising questions about why I spent so much time there. I couldn't tell Tommy about the things I loved about city life without making him worry that I would never be satisfied with small-town living. I lived in a constant state of vigilance, always monitoring my words, always remembering which stories I'd told to whom, always afraid that one careless comment would bring my whole elaborate construction crashing down around me. During this time, America itself was changing rapidly around me. President Kennedy was in the White House, talking about going to the moon and challenging us to ask what we could do for our country. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and young people everywhere were starting to question traditional values and expectations. Bob Dylan was singing about the times changing, and they certainly were. But I felt trapped in a lie that seemed to belong to an earlier, more restrictive era, when women were expected to choose between independence and love, between adventure and security, between the life they wanted and the life they were supposed to want. The Beatles arrived in America in early 1964, and I remember watching them on the Ed Sullivan Show in the boarding house common room with the other residents, all of us amazed by these young men with their long hair and infectious energy, who seemed to represent a completely new way of being young. But while other people my age were embracing the freedom and rebellion that the 60s were beginning to represent, I was locked into a pattern of deception that grew more complicated with each passing month. The first real scare came in the spring of 1963, when Jimmy surprised me by coming home early from a business trip. I was supposed to be in Paso Robles caring for my mother, but I'd actually just returned the day before and hadn't had time to establish my alibi properly. When he walked into our apartment unexpectedly with flowers and a bottle of wine, planning to surprise his wife after being away for 2 weeks, I had to quickly hide a letter from Tommy that was sitting open on our kitchen table and pretend I'd just gotten back from visiting the doctor about a persistent cough I'd developed. "You look tired, sweetheart," Jimmy said, studying my face with the concern of a man who loved me deeply and was beginning to notice changes in me that I couldn't explain. "Maybe these trips home are taking too much out of you. Your mother's illness has been going on for over a year now. Perhaps we should visit your folks together next time so I can help take care of things and you can get some rest." The thought of Jimmy meeting my family, who all knew about Tommy and would be expecting me to explain why I was married to someone else, made my blood run cold. I managed to deflect his offer by suggesting that my mother was too frail for visitors outside the family and that my presence alone was what she needed most. But I could see the hurt in Jimmy's eyes at being excluded from this important part of my life, and I hated myself for putting it there. What kind of wife keeps her husband away from her family? What kind of woman lies so casually to someone who trusts her completely? Meanwhile, in Paso Robles, Tommy was growing impatient with our prolonged engagement and my repeated delays in making our relationship official. He had finished building our house, a charming 2-bedroom cottage with a wraparound porch and the white picket fence he'd promised, located on a quiet street lined with oak trees where children played safely and neighbors knew each other's names. Every time I visited, he would walk me through the rooms, pointing out details he'd crafted specifically with me in mind, and asking when I was finally going to stop going back and forth and just stay with him permanently. "I've been patient, Maggie," he said during one visit in the summer of 1963. We were standing in what would be our bedroom, sunlight streaming through lace curtains his mother had made, and I could smell the new wood and fresh paint that spoke of hope and new beginnings. I love you, and I want to spend my life with you, but I need to know that you're serious about building a future together. People in town are starting to ask questions about when we're getting married, and I don't know what to tell them anymore. I promised him that I was serious, that I just needed a little more time to tie up loose ends in San Francisco and figure out how to end my marriage without creating a scandal that would hurt Jimmy. But the truth was, I was paralyzed by indecision and terrified of the consequences of choosing either path. I loved both men, but in completely different ways that spoke to different parts of my personality and different visions of what my life could be. Jimmy represented adventure and sophistication, the exciting urban life I'd always dreamed of when I was growing up in a small town that felt too small for my ambitions. With Jimmy, I was part of the larger world, connected to the currents of change and progress that were transforming America in the 1960s. Our life together was dynamic and unpredictable, filled with new experiences and opportunities for growth and discovery. Tommy represented roots and stability, the comfort of being truly known and accepted for who I was, underneath all the fashionable clothes and sophisticated mannerisms I'd adopted in the city. With Tommy, I was connected to the land and the community that had shaped me, to the values and traditions that had given meaning to my childhood and adolescence. Our life together would be quiet and predictable, but it would also be deep and authentic in ways that my city life sometimes felt it was not. How do you choose between two different versions of yourself? How do you decide which dreams to pursue and which to sacrifice? The weight of making such a momentous decision felt overwhelming, so I kept postponing it, telling myself that somehow things would work themselves out if I just waited long enough. But of course, things don't work themselves out when you refuse to make the hard choices that life demands. Instead, they usually work themselves out in the worst possible way, at the worst possible time, in front of the people you least want to hurt. The burden of maintaining two separate identities was taking a serious toll on my health and my sanity. I lost weight from the constant stress and developed chronic headaches that no amount of aspirin could cure. I had trouble sleeping, lying awake at night worrying about which story I'd told to whom, and whether I could keep track of all the lies I was telling. I became irritable and distracted at work, making mistakes that Mr. Morrison noticed but was too kind to mention directly. Mrs. O'Malley, who had known me since I first arrived in San Francisco, and had watched me grow from a nervous country girl into a confident young woman, began to comment on my haggard appearance. "You're working too hard, dear," she said one evening, as we sat in the boarding house parlor after dinner. "All this traveling back and forth to care for your mother is wearing you down. Perhaps it's time to consider bringing her to San Francisco, where you can look after her properly, without all this constant upheaval." But how could I explain that my mother wasn't actually as sick as I'd led everyone to believe? How could I admit that my frequent trips home had more to do with my own confusion and deception than with any family crisis? I made excuses about my mother being too attached to her home and her community to consider moving, but I could see the concern in Mrs. O'Malley's eyes and knew that she was beginning to suspect that something wasn't quite right with my story. The beginning of the end came in October 1963, just a month before President Kennedy would be assassinated in Dallas, and the whole country would be plunged into a period of grief and uncertainty that matched my own internal turmoil. It was during this atmosphere of impending change and unease that my mother's health took a genuine turn for the worse. She developed a severe case of pneumonia that required hospitalization, and this time, it wasn't an exaggeration or a convenient excuse for my travels. She was genuinely, seriously ill, and both my father and I were terrified we might lose her. I called Jimmy from the hospital payphone, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. "I have to go home immediately," I told him. "Mother might not make it through the week. and I need to be there for her and for Dad. For the first time since we'd been married, Jimmy insisted on coming with me, despite my desperate attempts to talk him out of it. "You shouldn't have to handle this alone, sweetheart," he said firmly. "I'm your husband, and this is what husbands do. We support each other through difficult times. I'll cancel my appointments and drive you down there myself. It's time I met your family properly anyway, especially under these circumstances." The drive to Paso Robles was a nightmare of anxiety for me. Jimmy chatted nervously about meeting my parents, asking questions about my childhood that I answered mechanically, while my mind raced through all the ways this situation could explode. I'd sent a telegram to Tommy warning him to stay away from the hospital, but I wasn't sure he'd received it, and I had no way to contact him again without arousing Jimmy's suspicion. At the hospital, my worst fears were realized. The small waiting room smelled of disinfectant and fear, filled with worried family members keeping vigil over their loved ones. Tommy was there, of course, sitting with my father and offering the kind of comfort that only someone who'd known our family for years could provide. He'd brought flowers from his garden and was quietly discussing my mother's condition with the doctor, taking the kind of responsibility that a future son-in-law would naturally assume in a crisis. When Jimmy and I walked through the door, the moment of recognition was immediate and devastating. I watched in horror as understanding dawned on both men's faces simultaneously, saw the confusion and betrayal and pain that flickered across their features as they processed what they were seeing. The small waiting room suddenly felt enormous, filled with a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Who the hell is this?" Jimmy demanded, his voice rising despite the hospital setting. He looked back and forth between Tommy and me, his face cycling through confusion, suspicion, and finally, a terrible understanding. "Maggie, who is this man? And why is he here acting like he belongs with your family?" Tommy stood up slowly, his carpenter's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his dark eyes fixed on Jimmy with a mixture of shock and growing anger. "I should be asking you the same question," he said, his voice deadly quiet in the way that meant he was struggling to control his temper. "Maggie, who is this man? And why are you with him?" The words I'd been dreading for almost 2 years tumbled out in a confused rush. I tried to explain, to somehow make sense of the inexplicable. But how do you explain to 2 men that you've been engaged to both of them simultaneously? How do you justify living a lie so elaborate that you've forgotten what the truth even looks like? How do you tell 2 people who love you that you've been deceiving them both for years? Not out of malice, but out of cowardice and confusion, and an inability to choose between 2 different versions of the life you want to live. "She's my wife," Jimmy said, pulling out his wallet to show his driver's license with our San Francisco address and our marriage certificate, which he always carried with him for some reason I'd never understood until that moment. "We've been married for over 2 years. We have an apartment together. She works at a fabric shop. We're planning to buy a house." His voice trailed off as he saw the engagement ring on my right hand, the ring that definitely wasn't the one he'd given me. Tommy's face crumpled as if he'd been physically struck. "She's wearing my grandmother's ring," he said, pointing to my right hand where I'd moved his engagement ring when Jimmy had unexpectedly decided to accompany me home. "We're supposed to be married next month. The church is booked. The flowers are ordered. I've built us a house." He looked at me with such pain and confusion that I wanted to disappear into the hospital floor. "Maggie, what is this? What's going on here?" The confrontation took place in hushed, angry whispers because we were in a hospital where my mother lay fighting for her life, just down the hall. But even whispered, their words felt like shouting in my ears. Jimmy's accusations of betrayal and deception. Tommy's broken questions about why I'd led him on for so long. Both men demanding explanations I couldn't give because I didn't understand my own motivations anymore. "How long?" Jimmy asked, his voice hollow with hurt. How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been married to me while planning to marry him?" When I couldn't answer, he turned to Tommy with a bitter laugh. "She's been telling you she's single, hasn't she? While she's been telling me that she's just visiting her sick mother." "We've both been played for fools." Tommy shook his head, his confusion evident. "She told me she was married, but that she was getting divorced. She said she just needed time to settle things properly, that she wanted to end things without hurting anyone. I've been waiting for over a year for her to come home, permanently." He looked at me with dawning understanding. "But you were never going to leave him, were you? You were never going to choose." That was the moment when the full magnitude of what I'd done hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been trying to choose between two men. I'd been trying to have both of them, to live two different lives simultaneously, without ever having to sacrifice either one. I'd been so afraid of making the wrong choice that I'd made the worst choice possible, deceiving two good men who deserved so much better than what I'd given them. In the end, they left together, walking out of my life simultaneously, just as the sun was setting over the hills surrounding Paso Robles. Jimmy threw his wedding ring at my feet and told me not to bother coming back to San Francisco, that he'd have my things sent to my parents' house. Tommy pulled his grandmother's ring off my finger with hands that shook with emotion and told me that he never wanted to see me again, that he couldn't even look at me without feeling sick. "I hope it was worth it," Jimmy said as they walked toward the exit together. Two men who had nothing in common except the fact that they'd both been betrayed by the same woman. "I hope whatever you were looking for was worth destroying both of our lives." Tommy didn't say anything at all, but the look he gave me over his shoulder was worse than any words could have been. A look of complete disappointment from someone who had loved me since we were children and had believed I was better than this. My mother died 3 days later, never knowing about the chaos her illness had precipitated. She slipped away peacefully in her sleep while I sat beside her bed, holding her hand and whispering apologies she would never hear. The funeral was a nightmare of whispered conversations and sidelong glances from people who had heard about the scandal at the hospital. In a small town like Paso Robles, news traveled fast, and by the time we laid my mother to rest, everyone knew that Margaret Rose Peterson had been caught living a double life that had hurt two good men and brought shame on her family. My father barely spoke to me during those awful days, his grief over losing his wife complicated by his bewilderment at his daughter's behavior. "I don't understand you, Margaret," he said the night before the funeral, using my full name in the way he had when I was a child and had disappointed him. "I raised you to be honest and decent, to treat people with respect and kindness. How did you become someone who could lie so easily to people who loved you?" I had no answer for him then, and I'm not sure I have a complete answer even now. All I can say is that I was young and confused and terrified of making permanent choices that would close off other possibilities. I wanted everything: the excitement of city life and the comfort of small-town roots, the sophisticated charm of Jimmy and the steady devotion of Tommy, the independence of a career woman, and the security of a traditional marriage. I was too immature to understand that having everything often means appreciating nothing, that trying to avoid difficult choices usually results in losing all your options. The aftermath of losing both men and my mother within the span of a week left me completely adrift, like a ship that had lost its anchor and was being tossed around by forces beyond its control. I returned to San Francisco to find that Jimmy had been true to his word. He'd had the locks changed on our apartment, and my belongings were packed in boxes waiting in the hallway outside our door. Mrs. O'Malley took pity on me and let me move back into my old room on the 3rd floor, though she made it clear that my reputation in the neighborhood was now decidedly questionable. "I don't know what you did, dear," she said as she helped me carry my boxes upstairs, "but I can see that you're paying for it now. We all make mistakes, but some mistakes cost more than others. Her kindness in taking me back was tempered by a new coolness in her manner, and I could feel the judgment in her eyes even when she was trying to be charitable. Mr. Morrison, bless his kind heart, allowed me to keep my job at the fabric shop, but I could feel the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. The scandal had somehow followed me back to the city, carried by the network of gossip that connected small towns to urban centers in ways I'd never fully appreciated. Customers who had once chatted with me about their projects now conducted their business efficiently and left without the friendly conversation that had made the work so pleasant. I became a cautionary tale, the girl who had tried to have her cake and eat it too, and had ended up with nothing but crumbs and regret. For months, I barely functioned, going through the motions of daily life like a ghost haunting my own existence. I went to work, came home, ate simple meals alone in my small room, and tried to read books that couldn't hold my attention for more than a few minutes at a time. The weight of what I'd done, the relationships I'd destroyed, the trust I'd broken, pressed down on me like a physical burden that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. I'd lost not just two men who loved me, but also my sense of who I was as a person. If I could lie so completely to the people closest to me, what did that say about my character? What kind of woman was I really? The confident, ambitious girl who had left Paso Robles with such high hopes seemed like a stranger to me now, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and didn't particularly like. The answer to those questions came slowly, through the long process of rebuilding my life from the ground up, with a foundation of honesty instead of deception. I found a small apartment in the Richmond district, far from the places that held memories of Jimmy and our brief marriage. I started attending evening classes at City College, studying bookkeeping and office management, skills that would allow me to support myself without depending on anyone else. I began volunteering at St. Mary's Cathedral, helping with their charity work among the poor and homeless who gathered in the church basement for meals and shelter. Slowly, through small acts of service and honesty, I began to reclaim some sense of worth and purpose. The work wasn't glamorous. Ladling soup into bowls, sorting donated clothes, teaching basic reading skills to adults who had never learned. But it was real in a way that my double life had never been. When I helped serve meals at the soup kitchen, or tutored children who were struggling with reading, or sat with elderly people who had no family to visit them, I felt connected to something larger than my own wants and fears. The people I worked with in those charity programs didn't know about my scandal, and they didn't care about my past mistakes. They judged me only on what I contributed in the present moment, and gradually I began to see myself through their eyes, rather than through the lens of my own guilt and shame. I learned that redemption doesn't come from grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but from the accumulation of small, honest actions performed day after day with genuine care for others. Years passed before I felt ready to even think about romantic relationships again. The 1960s continued to roar around me. The Beatles and the Beach Boys, Vietnam protests and civil rights marches, hippies in Golden Gate Park and the Summer of Love. But I lived quietly on the margins of all that excitement, focused on building a life based on truth rather than fantasy. I learned to find joy in simple things. The fog rolling in over the marine headlands at sunset, the sound of sea lions barking at Pier 39, the first spring flowers blooming in Golden Gate Park after the long winter rains. I dated occasionally. Nice men who worked in banks or